Thanks. And thanks, Fabian, Annette, and Inka. It was a great pleasure to be actually in Dortmund and to see Hardware, which is a kind of a very legendary space and has kind of driven so many kind of interesting developments in media art, but also reflections on the space in which media art relates to contemporary art and also contemporary society. So it's a very exciting place to be for me, as it's a place that's helped me think and has kind of forced me to think on many occasions. What I'm going to try and argue, or try and discuss, is probably an absence of that thinking in a certain way. But it's, in a sense, it was interesting to look at the panel beforehand, because I think there's a very strong kind of set of themes that were offered there that I think the paper I'm going to present offers a kind of tangential take through those and allows maybe for certain kinds of infleshings in cultural terms and technical terms of the kinds of debates that we had this morning. So I want to start with an event. In 1812, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley could be found on a beach in the west of England dropping revolutionary texts into empty bottles. The texts criticised the corrupt Regency government, or the Regency monarchy of the time, and advocated a republic. Shelley caught the texts up and tossed them into the sea. Time and tide swallowed them up and may indeed have gifted them to the ocean or drifted the bottles over to Wales on the other side of the Bristol Channel. It's not recorded whether anyone ever received his messages, and it was only 10 years later that Shelley himself was lost into the water. It was a good 50 years until, building on the work of Newton and Laplace, the physicist Lord Kelvin produced the first analog simple-purpose computer, the tidal predictor. If only Shelley had hung on until that moment, he could have indulged in the use of computational prediction to fling his tracts into the waves at the optimal moment. Nowadays, thanks to the iron laws of progress, we have algorithms to do this for us. How, though, can we also make such rule-based operations allies? How might they be worked with as the natural condition in which the unexpected may float and find its aleatory way somewhere interesting? In an environment saturated with rules and effective procedures that govern and induce our behaviour as subjects, how can the tides and fluxions of laws, regulations, terms of use, contracts, permission structures, recommendation systems, security measures, interfaces, and other such things become stimulating allies and influences? Indeed, noting the way in which the Invisible Committee, following Leroy-Gorin and others, remarked that technology fundamentally constitutes the human, or as some would call it, the post-human, as much as it called into being and is reciprocated by this entity. What are the ways in which this co-constitution can be experimented with? This talk, then, is about the tactical mode of rules and how, in a software culture working with and amongst multiple scales and kinds of rules and their interactions, may allow for a certain kind of procedural politics and aesthetics that crosses from micro to macro scales. The philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead stated once that civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. Despite a base of evidence to support such a supposition, Whitehead's proposal does not equate directly to a formula wherein the most thoughtless are the most civilized. Whitehead was talking about scientific advance towards the clarity of mathematics, but there is a certain sense that a society can be inversely mapped by what it considers to be beneath the crust of thought. One of the most important kinds of rule to work with and to inhabit at a tangent to itself is that of the norm. When, as Inka Arndt's notes, the yes men pull on second-hand suits to semiotically lubricate their way into a business conference, or when the Hungarian abortion campaigners' abortourism present themselves using a pop-up information display stand of the same style and design as any honest-to-goodness multinational putting out its feelers on the street, they recognize that thinking involves too much friction. Equally useful, the technology of the suit, the display stand, and other such things come with a certain repertoire of body language that provides a cultural exoskeleton that assists movement and the presentation of a self. Observance of norms smooths integration. For carrying out graffiti, fly postering, or other adjustments, use a high-visibility jacket in order not to be seen. People, organizations, and brands make identities that are there to help you. A useful comparison to civilization, in the sense we can derive from Whitehead's phrase, is the evolution of the different species of cuckoo. Information processing is an evolutionary cost, so the evolution of host species' ability to discern one of their own eggs from that of a cuckoo eats energy, opportunities, and resources. As a result, certain species of cuckoo can be differentiated by the point at which their co-evolutionary ruse trails off. Some produce eggs that are identical to the host. Others go further, and not only their eggs, but also their hatchlings bear the same features. Others have further differentiated to produce chicks with the same set of key features, and with some host species introduce differentiation on the basis of a call and response that researchers see as analogous to a password. Others add benefits after passing the egg stage. The carrion crow may host eggs from the great spotted cuckoo. Their nests, however, are protected from predators who are repelled by a foul-smelling secretion expelled from the infant cuckoo's cloaca. Here, the considerations for tactical intervention by norms become considerable. These norms emerge from the evolutionary interplay of multiple factors of a great anonymous figuring out. There is no ultimate solution of the problem of resistance, either how to enact or contain it. Resistance and such figuring out is a coefficient of life. A concomitant factor to the advance of civilization is thus that of ignorance. As more systems, processes, entities, and technologies exist about which it is unnecessary to know how they work, the greater the volume of ignorance produced overall. Indeed, ignorance becomes an economic and organizational factor with its own literature and sociology. Friedrich Hayek is one of the masters of thinking out the role of ignorance in economic form, for instance. Figuring out becomes entrained, canalized, a matter of habituation and the generation of further norms. The Hegelian modelization of such a process run by Guy Debord would call it a recuperation, as styles, statements, partially radical acts are sucked into and reinvigorate the holding patterns of society. But perhaps this requires too much work, too many opportunity costs, and immodestly reads the artist or subversive as always already a threat. Indeed, we have something more diffuse. Norms are generated by the multifactorial interplay of norm upon norm. Debord was onto something, but looking for the ultimate break from society now reads more like some kind of vacation inducement, with pina coladas interchangeable with Molotovs. A pity that it's not that convulsively beautiful and simple, but perhaps the ultimate break is always just over the edge of the horizon, in some year zero or other, in a little bar in Magaluf run by Pol Pot. The radical technologists of the 20th century, stretching from those engaged in feminist improvements to domestic labor, to Soviet humanist technologists, and the convivial technology espoused by Ivan Illich, and the anarchist theories of technology, such as Colin Ward or Murray Bookchin, saw ignorance as something to be surpassed by education and the development of technologies that elicited knowledge in those using them as a byprocess of empowerment. The development of particular technologies that encourage autonomy and collaboration would tend to help precipitate such qualities in the wider political condition. But it might be noted that such qualities are not inherently virtues, or at least have numerous cretinized doubles. Their work, that of the kind of radical humanist technologists, is still valid and deserves to be a source of further inspiration. However, there's also a sense in which they saw technology as distinct enough from the human to be properly reasoned about, and hence made fully distinct from it. Alongside such a possibility, we might note that technologies stimulate behaviours around and through them. Part of the delight of this can be found in dance crazes, such as those that mimic work. Such formulations are incorporations of energies and desires into standardized bodily and epistemic routines that have their own complex relations to ignorance, to norms, and other kind of protocols. Alongside these heroic successes are forgotten transport solutions that fail to elicit reciprocations in the bodies of those imagined as users. The vast dung heaps of apps that never disrupted anything but the sleep of their coders. Technologies may fail to inhabit the nest effectively. In this condition, technologies may co-evolve, correspond to and trigger certain societal developments that are momentarily conducive to certain kinds of information circulation and resistance. At other times, such technologies may be coupled with other systems of governmental or economic forms that sift and filter them into a kind of reduced normality. Here, the labour of passing, familiar from gender, class, and race-based regimes of norming, may become operative. In such a condition, identification with and utilisation of hegemonic norms as a learned embodied skill, but also something that reason can perhaps take a splitting distance from, makes it all the better for other things to be going on backstage. One of the approaches to the norm farming of populations has been that of over-identification. Here, rules are held as sacred, saturated with goodness, and are raised up for veneration. Art collectives working with the strategy of over-identification made a parallel history out of such idolatry, marking uncanny affinities between aesthetic modes and patterns of belief outside of their ostensive ideological reference. One can think of the Agents and Provocateurs exhibition at Hardware in 2010, for instance, as exploring this kind of theme. Taking things literally is also a ruse of industrial and trade unionism in the tactic of the work to rule. Here, instructions from management or for the operation of machinery are taken at fastidiously literal face value. Observing the rule will, in conditions where too many demands are made, but which rely on the collaboration of workers to work around them, take risks or to bend the rules, generate clashes, overproduction, even blasphemies against Gantt charts and organograms. It may result in work left standing or broken machines. One of the advances of freelance and creative labour over that of the factory is that work to rule is now distributed out into the social, where work takes place. Work to rule becomes domestic and fills the nest. Forgeries, knockoffs, replicas, elaborate rhetorics of faint praise are all fundamental to the activity of the art world and any commodity market with the merest whiff of luxury about it. Codes, requirements, learning, observation, and observance of the rules are also core to the enjoyment of the categorical machines of class, gender, and race. We can take pleasure in playing along, in triggering and being triggered by such regimes. Yet it's also impossible to fully inhabit them. They're a curse, but they're also a curse in their observation. For instance, the more socialist realism became codified and enforced as a dominant aesthetic mode, the more it conformed to pristine parody. It was merely necessary to smile, nod, and repeat to play out its own falling short of the ideal that it attempted to provide visual exemplars for. What can be observed, however, is the value created in the vacillation between identity and non-identity. So the movement backwards and forwards between identity and non-identity. Expertise of a pragmatic and immanent kind is required to verify the identity of one spot painting over another, one street art spraying over that of another squirt. Value is created at precisely the point that they teeter on the edge of anonymity and are pulled back into the domain of a certified prestige. But they can also go the other way. Imagination and identification is required to embrace this season's fashion over the last. Over-identification flattens out this movement by refusing the capacity to generate and participate in difference. Passionate indifference is an embrace of the norm at the crest of its wave, an idea of such a wave that imagines it as a continuous vector proceeding gloriously into a calculable future. Imagine a subjectivity that's always taking part in whatever is trending. Politics, war, and economics in the present day are full of proxies, shell companies, greenwashing, art washing, front organizations, sock puppets, arm's length, and disownable entities. They occupy ideational and geographic territory, provoke, make dummy runs, eat up resources, sow doubts, and allow for measures that would not be possible to take otherwise. Trademarks and brands are maintained as stable reservoirs of value differentiation whilst being coagulated, homogenized, run as investment vehicles. Mainstream politicians are elected to the leaderships of their parties on the sole basis of their being the least disagreeable. Proxies are supplemented by approximates. Nothing is there because it should be there in its own terms. We live in a historical moment when a genuine, bold-faced lie or act of public self-exposure as a bigot seems more genuine and admirable than much of the earnest moralizing that accompanies it as a decrying chorus. This is the pleasure, for instance, of the populist and the troll. As part of the world of proxies, the art of public relations has always operated on a bait-and-switch principle as a primary mode of conflict and of politics. Corresponding to this, the ruinously believing fundamentalists of various kinds gain in that they offer a truth so stupid it demands to be believed simply to force the fact that something, anything, must be believed in. The problem is not assisted by the cretinous self-glorifying of all these free people that want to assert their freedoms. Even critique, with its practice of revealing the truth behind an appearance, may play into the game. The movement of revelatory critique simply becomes another instance of the exercise of virtuosic skill, except here the very idea of a bait, a truth to be revealed, becomes what is switched for the moment of revelation. There is thus an arms race between the explication and instantiation of such powers with the basic truth already known. Yet we live also in a time when such measures are multivalent and fundamental to the economic apparatus and indeed generative of value. The condition of critique and expose has its own set of dynamics. Some of these result in quiescence or outrage, depending on their combination with other factors, such as actual or imagined capacities to respond. Alongside such a condition of revelation as generative of information and value, scams and get-rich-quick schemes are perpetuated through the imaginary and actual savvy in the manipulation or generation of rule sets. In these, they are sometimes assisted by numerous kinds of perverse incentives. The public debate around tax evasion and avoidance merges with that of rule bending and rule buying in environmental regulations. And there are also crazes that inhabit existing rule sets or technological innovations such as Bitcoin that require the adoption of a procedure and a technology both within and partially outside of existing frameworks, something we can see in the Median Group Bitnik work upstairs. The selection and implementation of an exquisitely formed rule set or operation in tax evasion, critique, or scamming may raise them to the status of an art. The inhabitation or creation of such things as short or long-term conditions with their tactical or strategic dimensions accounts for numerous modes of cultural formation. Key amongst these is computing. Programming is an activity of rule following and rule invention par excellence. Indeed, if it doesn't follow the correct syntax, code won't run. All programming involves the use of pre-existing software such as operating systems, networks, libraries of codes, compilers, and so on. It's an environment that requires multiple levels of compliance and recourse to pre-existing concatenations of rules. This is what in part makes it attractive as a paradigm for those aiming to move the design of operating systems out from computers to networks, to cities, and to social forms. It's infrequent that governments exhibit charismatic abundance, especially those inflicting the technical governance on those countries configured as debt-stricken warnings. So why not let some reputable brand with a latter-day ethics department design the shell game for a civilization which has forgotten itself? Such a proposition is even more attractive given the immense plasticity of computational forms, and hence that of the social structures that might be invented through them. We might read the governing rule set of a packet switching network running TCP/IP as boiling down to the communist dictum, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Here, each is a node in the network, and what is handled is traffic. Part of the tragedy of the internet is the subordination of this underlying condition to other regimes. Indeed, a rule of thumb now is that one should behave on the public internet with the same attention to not giving any game away as one does in an airport. The simple miraculousness of not actually being so prudent is what makes much of what arises on the net so fascinating in its enormous quantity. Scandals of nature, of things adopting an ostensibly unregulated form, or of the migration of norms from one context to another, the affordance for them to amass constitute much of what banks up online. The post-Turing computer integrates all symbol systems in a decomposed and abstracted version of a calculation process. That is to say that it may duplicate, provide the grounds and means for all systems of regulation, law, exchange, normalization, communication, and information to be abstracted, invented, and put into place. The movement between prior practices in industries, media systems, and social forms, and the versions which, when abstracted into sets of manipulable systems, symbols, formats, and procedures, merge with computational forms and dynamics, and thus changes, and does not simply replicate what came before. Here we have a diagram of an equivalence between some statements in Boolean logic and the logical equivalence in zeros and ones as in an electronic circuit. Contemporary network computing integrates symbol-based systems and systems of power. In such a condition, rule sets become infrastructure. That is to say that they govern and put into place integrated sets of relations that operate from micro to macro scales. The position of computational rules as infrastructure requires interrelation with hardware, objects, and processes, and the ongoing development of new kinds of sensor, handling equipment, and organization, amongst other things. But it also means that tactics of spoofing, man-in-the-middle attacks, bugs, backdoors, exploits, illicit privilege escalation within permission structures, hoaxing, doxing, denial of service, and other modes of operation developed in the context of hacking become interpolated as a form of behavior within wider fields of actors, as military and spying activities, for instance, all of which may be in turn carried out by proxies and deniable forces. Here, the rule of the fake, that is indistinguishable from the real due to simply operational necessity, moves from the domain of art into that of information warfare. Distinct from this condition, but facilitating it, is a fundamental aspect of informational governance. The more it organises entities within it according to particular identifiers, humans with passports, images with metadata or pattern match descriptions, places with numerical map references, users with identities, and the more it organises those references amongst themselves in uniformly manipulable arrays of symbols, the more it is susceptible to a number of challenges. One primary challenge is that of reading the identifier for the actuality. We're all familiar with the digital double preceding and apprehending the movement of the person. Gaining a document, an ID, a password, and a username, a visa, can be worth struggling for in Calais or by taking a leaky boat across the Mediterranean because of what it in turn gives access to. A key problem, however, is secondary and less considered. As more and more information is gathered, ordered, regularized, and arranged in relations to norms and recognized patterns, the more it is susceptible to correlations. A simple example is the way in which information about a user's mother's maiden name or the name of their first pet or school might be used as emergency prompts for password changing within websites. At the same time as such systems expand, there's an increase in the number of information sources from which such data about an individual or other entity can be more readily addressed. So once you have these systems that exist as password prompts, the more systems also emerge that provide that form of information in readily available forms. Numerous other examples can and will be found. As the Internet of Things grows, such data may leak out of a washing machine or a lamppost. As a wider technological movement, the ease of information gathering, comparison, and interoperation enables the supposed discreteness of nominally separate systems to be functionally integrated in potentially antagonistic ways. The company that prides itself on organizing the world's information is in effect operating a brute force attack on itself. That is to say that the interaction of rules and norms in an economic environment that is also predilected towards the establishment of monopolies makes itself highly fragile around questions in which security depends on the non-integration of systems that are predisposed towards convergence. Here, the observance of rules creates the condition for its own evisceration. This is a case of the industrialization of paradox, something logically anomalous arising from the interplay of a rule on itself, between two or several rules, or between a rule set and what it supposedly describes. As information monopolies strengthen themselves, they potentially become increasingly open to such a predicament. Paradox is inherently where the stresses accrue in a rule set, both in a psychic and existential sense, and in the way in which different systems of symbolization, action, and governance interweave to create thickly generative or peculiarly sparse conditions. According to the distribution of labor, hackers tend to populate the latter, artists the former. These figures are becoming muddled and anachronistic, unsatisfactory, but with a useful legacy of tools and modes of attention. Given this instability of fixed rules and their multiscalar interrelation in and as the world, there is a drive to establish an understanding, or accurately an apprehension, of phenomena before they become established as such. One of the nascent ways in which this condition is attended to by the state, agents acting at arm's length for it, and by other organizations is through working via techniques of big data. The condition of big data is in part generated in a drive to capture and act amongst incipient rules, emergent norms, non-explicatory conformities that come from elsewhere, in modes that are not easily discernible. Arising from sources that may be unpredetermined in terms of category and quality, voluminous in quantity, and highly varied in terms of source and kind, big data is in part an attempt to apply cybernetic approaches of underspecification to information analysis. A system needs to be open enough to work with what it is not yet specifically designed for. Such approaches may elicit information and acquire targets that are rule-observing, norm-following, even entirely normopathic, but that also induce vague conditions that have yet to crystallize. Here, there is an information theoretical scale to the problem. All the combinations of data and time taken to compute them measured against the value or urgency of their use. In this context, where analytical infrastructures inhabit in advance, even if only a mathematically delimited advance, the spaces and modes of the tactical or of resistance, the question arises of which modes of artifice might be adequate to inhabiting the flows and tides of time and events to take messages of the abnormal and the unruly towards new shores. Whitehead's famous dictum about the growth of knowledge was written at a time before the First World War, when a stable front line of knowledge could perhaps be imagined. For him, operations of thoughts are like cavalry charges in a battle, brief, resolving forays that stabilize and expand territory. Here, knowledge is a war machine with a stable rear guard. In a period in which has the uncanny luck of reflection on such a past, but a dangerously muted sense of prospection, we can suggest a couple of things. Rules might be the anomaly, and norms, if played the right way, might just bring you a little perverse pleasure. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matt, a lot for your talk. Are there any questions which you might ask right now? Any questions from the audience? Feel free to ask. Okay, I say thanks a lot for this. We will gather here. Okay, Lucien.
Yeah, sure.
I was rethinking what you said about, what did you say? Something about the concatenation of rules and programming is about the programming of rules. So I was just rethinking the relation between rules and norms. Okay. Within this context, and then you have also this kind of you talk about the cuckoo, and then you talk about the Boolean logic. So there's all these levels of rules and norms of behavior, and so how can we differentiate it? Because it seems to me that interestingly to me, sorry, we work together, but we never talk. So it seems that. You said rules are the anomaly, norms can bring some perverse play. So you are rethinking rules and norms, but you're thinking of rules in terms of, not just in terms of instructions, are you? And so how are you thinking about the relation between rules, norms, and instructions? And what does programming do in relation to this? You must have an idea, I think.
Well, I think rules and norms are different, but they're interrelated. So a norm is, for instance, the stabilization of a cuckoo in relationship to his host species. So if the perceptions of the host species provide a fitness landscape against which the kind of norm observation of the cuckoo is tested, we can say that the norm is what stabilizes out in the middle of those. And we can say that there are social norms that also emerge in such a way. Some of the landscape in which social norms now operate is constructed due to programmatic or computational structures, and these provide rules. So these rule systems then also interact with each other and produce norms in which rule sets operate. So you have this dual movement in a sense that they're mutually co-constituting, but not symmetrically so. And it's this way in which rule sets interpolate, provoke, and induce new kinds of norms. Understanding that rule sets can also be, immensely open and generative, unending, etc., etc. Also means that the generation of norms can be an open-ended game, but it also means there are particular moments where they intersect that produce potentially extreme problems. For instance, if you have a company that is organizing all the world's information, we can think of one or two, that is organizing both the data to control password access to servers, for instance, and is also organizing the data on everyone's mother's maiden name or their first pet or the school they went to, and making that information available. This corporation is basically hacking its own system of security. So you get very interesting kind of convergences where you have systems that are designed to silo security are being incorporated into wider systems of information integration in which there are kind of uncanny or paradoxical convergences. And to me, those are the interesting points for understanding kind of political action or invention, but they're also the places in which new forms of value are kind of being constituted as well, and that can then be occupied by forces with other kinds of structure. As in in your talk, the kind of discussion of new forms of capitalism that emerge in such kinds of spaces.
Here's another question.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question relating to the use of norms too and the differentiation between rules, but I would be interested how you would make a difference or whether it is important to make a difference between norms which relate to the question of the living. So as for example, you showed it with a bird, with a little bird, with a cuckoo. And norms which relate to norms which were, kind of part of a society, as a society which goes back to the 19th century, so biopolitics, for example. So, and there is a discussion between Nguyen and Foucault, which is very kind of known, and Nguyen was the one who tried to, or who said that you can make a differentiation between the living and the non-living by saying that the living tries to give its own norms to the environment, to change the environment relating to its own, not to its or her or she. Her own norms, but this is not the case in the question of rules. And then Foucault kind of showed that the differentiation between the living and the non-living, or rules or norms and rules, is not enough, because we have biopolitics, which makes it much more complicated to make a difference between the living and the non-living. So I would be interested it's a very, but if you could elaborate about this, the fact that if we speak of norms, we speak somehow of values and somehow of subjects. So Whitehead would say norms relate to subjects, but at the same time it's not so easy to differentiate it, because we live in a very complicated and society.
Yeah, no, it's a very good observation, very good kind of set of questions. I think a way I'd look at it would be to think about norms as not simply being the qualities that are exhibited by the living. One can also talk about statistical norms, for instance, and the kind of interplay of norms becomes something that is biopolitically active in many ways, as kind of Foucault elaborated. But I think we're in a condition of the move towards, we're in the middle of the transition to a computational paradigm of social formation, and in this condition we have a change in the state of what constitute norms and what constitute rules, and they start to mirror each other and start to produce kind of interesting relations of feedback between each other. And what would have passed for a rule in the 19th century now passes for a norm, let's say, in the 21st century. So there's a kind of way in which the constitution of rules and norms becomes a different set of qualities, and they also act in different ways, at different speeds, at different levels of granularity, with different degrees of apprehension of factors or of descriptions of the entities that they're in relation with. So I think we're at a stage where we have to start mapping some of these kinds of factors with other kinds of tools. And part of that means some kind of engagement with the technical at a fundamental level, which is kind of outside of the scope of Foucault and of Canguilhem in a certain way. So this kind of way in which we can work a genealogy of theory going back to their work also means that we have to address the questions that are posed to us in the present, which means this kind of it's a broader category of change in a sense, but it means we also have to address the computational and the objects that are classically owned and generated by computer science with the tools that we have from cultural theory, political theory, and so on. Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, thanks again. Thanks a lot, Matthew Fuller. We will continue with a screening of 2 works at 3:30, Kopfwende Hassloch by Jürgen Brügger and Jörg Hasengier, and Parallel 2 by Harun Farocki. So see you in a bit, and thanks.